Before we dive into this unforgettable story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join the Brave Animals family, where real heroes have paws, instincts, and hearts braver than most people you'll ever meet. It started like any other Tuesday at the small-town police department in Lark Hill, Ohio. Officers trickled in with half-drunk coffees, morning yawns, and tired eyes still adjusting to the fluorescent lights of the station. The mood was casual, predictable, safe, until the new guy barked, not the rookie, the dog. His name was Thor, a 4-year-old German shepherd with sharp eyes and an even sharper nose, recently transferred from a K9 unit in Chicago. Thor wasn't loud or restless. He wasn't the type to bark at shadows. That's what made his outburst so chilling. He stood frozen in front of a specific locker number 41, belonging to Officer Darren Whitmore, a 10-year veteran of the Lark Hill force. Thor didn't just sniff it. He didn't scratch. He planted his paws wide, let out a deep guttural growl, and barked, loud, sharp, repeated, refusing to stop. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a dog acting up. Some officers chuckled. Others rolled their eyes. "Probably smells a snack or something," one of them said. But Thor wouldn't budge. Not when his handler, Officer Melanie Cross, tugged at his leash. Not when the captain raised an eyebrow. Not even when Whitmore himself arrived and laughed it off with a shrug. "Got a meatball sub in there from yesterday," he joked, trying to mask the flicker of tension in his eyes. But Thor knew. And within 24 hours, the FBI would walk through the front door. Officer Cross had worked with enough dogs to know one thing. When they bark like that, they're not confused. They're calling out a truth no one else can see yet. She crouched beside Thor and touched his side gently, trying to calm him. "Easy, boy," she whispered. But his eyes stayed locked on that metal locker like it was a loaded gun. Whitmore looked visibly irritated. "It's just my gear in there," he muttered. "You want me to open it?" "Go ahead," the captain said, arms crossed. Whitmore hesitated, just for a second. Then he turned the dial, popped the lock, and pulled the door open with a dramatic swing. Nothing. Just a perfectly arranged shelf with his badge, vest, backup firearm, and a small stack of training reports, but Thor kept barking. Louder now, more urgent. Melanie's brow furrowed. "I think there's more to this." Later that evening, after the station quieted down, Melanie couldn't shake the feeling in her gut. Thor had never reacted like that before, not even when they'd raided a meth lab in Chicago. She returned to the locker with Captain Reeves's permission and did a deeper inspection. She tapped along the back panel, felt the edges, and noticed something odd. A slight rattle when she knocked along the bottom. Pulling out a flashlight, she saw what looked like a false base panel, crudely fastened with 2 mismatched screws. Her heart began to pound. She unscrewed it and slid the panel loose. Inside was a sealed plastic bag containing what looked like a bloody child's sock and a Polaroid photo of a little girl, no older than 6, with a purple ribbon in her hair and fear in her eyes. Melanie gasped. The air left her lungs. Her hands trembled. This wasn't just a hidden item. It was evidence. Maybe worse. The next morning, the Lark Hill Police Department was no longer just a sleepy station. FBI agents from Cincinnati arrived in 2 unmarked SUVs. Thor watched them enter, tail stiff, eyes alert. He knew. The FBI agent leading the case, Agent Nora Temple, asked to speak with Officer Cross privately. "That photo," she said, pulling out a file, matches a girl who went missing in a neighboring state 2 years ago. Her name was Avery Halston. Still an open case, never solved. Melanie felt like the floor was tilting beneath her feet. "You're telling me Whitmore had this the whole time?" Temple nodded grimly. "And this sock? Blood matched to Avery's. Parents threw rapid DNA. Whoever hid this wanted it buried for good." Whitmore was called into questioning. His demeanor changed. He was no longer the sarcastic, confident veteran. He was tight-lipped, defensive, and cold. He denied everything. Claimed he'd never seen the items before. Blamed it on someone trying to frame him. But there was no sign of forced entry on the locker. And then Thor did it again. This time he walked straight to Whitmore's police cruiser in the back lot, sat beside it, and stared. That stare, silent, patient, accusing, was worse than barking. A forensic sweep of the vehicle found fibers from a purple ribbon in the back seat. Word spread through the department like wildfire. Officers who'd known Whitmore for years were speechless. Some defended him. Others started recalling odd little things. Unexplained absences, traffic logs that didn't line up, stories that never quite made sense. Meanwhile, Thor's reputation soared. "He's not just a dog," one officer whispered. "He's a damn compass." The station's atmosphere changed. Where there used to be banter and morning chatter, there was now silence. Eyes darted. Trust cracked. The break room coffee tasted bitter. The building felt smaller, heavier, and in the middle of it all sat Thor, quiet now, but watching. Always watching. The girl in the photo still hadn't been found, but the trail had reopened. And the barking that started it all? It hadn't been random. It had been a cry for justice. The Larkhill Police Department no longer felt like the same building. What used to be a tight-knit team of local officers now felt like a room full of strangers. Since the day Thor barked at Officer Whitmore's locker and evidence surfaced linking him to a cold missing child case, the station had been split by an invisible line. On one side, there were those who refused to believe Whitmore could ever be involved in anything dark. They leaned on the years they had worked beside him, the jokes he cracked, the cases he solved. On the other side stood a growing number of people who had begun to question everything. Melanie Cross found herself right in the middle of that line. She didn't want to believe it either, but Thor hadn't just barked. He had sounded an alarm, and in her gut, she knew his instincts had never been wrong. The FBI had set up a small command post in one of the unused offices on the second floor. Agent Nora Temple, sharp-eyed and composed, took charge with the calm of someone used to walking into tangled messes. What bothered Melanie most was that the case was moving fast, but something still felt off, like there was more no one was seeing yet. And Thor? He was restless again. That morning, as she stepped outside with him for their usual walk around the station perimeter, Thor kept glancing toward the far end of the lot. Not toward Whitmore's cruiser, which had already been taken in for evidence, but toward the old chain-link fence behind the shed where unused gear was stored. Melanie gave the leash a gentle tug. "Come on, boy. We've done this route 100 times." But Thor wouldn't budge. Instead, he pulled in the opposite direction toward the shed. Melanie followed. They reached the metal structure, the morning dew still clinging to the lock on the door. Thor's nose pressed against the bottom edge. He let out a low growl, then barked once, short, sharp. Melanie's hand went to her radio. "Dispatch, this is Cross. I need access to the rear storage shed. Can someone bring the spare keys?" 10 minutes later, the janitor arrived with a key ring and a puzzled look. The shed was mostly empty, just a few weather-beaten chairs, a broken copier, and 2 old evidence lockers that hadn't been moved in years. But Thor walked straight to one of them. Melanie slowly opened the rusted door. Inside, beneath a pile of dusty forms and unused flashlights, was a cardboard box labeled MISC. In it, wrapped in a flannel shirt, was a small bracelet, pink plastic beads. A name spelled out in colorful letters, Avery. Melanie's chest tightened. This wasn't just another piece of evidence. It was personal. Something the child had worn. Something that shouldn't be here. She called it in. Within the hour, Agent Temple was back on scene, gloves on, carefully bagging the bracelet. "This wasn't logged into evidence," Temple said, her tone measured but tight. "No record of this item anywhere in the original files. Which means someone hid it here intentionally." Melanie nodded, her throat dry. "Thor found it?" Temple looked down at the dog, who now sat beside the open locker, his ears still alert. "Whatever this dog is picking up on," she said softly, "it's not over yet." The town of Larkhill hadn't made the national news in years, maybe decades. But when the news broke that a police officer was being investigated in connection to a missing child case, reporters showed up like moths to a flame. Camera vans parked across from the station, microphones extended from behind barriers. The mayor held a tense press conference assuring the public that everything would be handled with transparency and that law enforcement would be held to the highest standard. Inside the station, tensions were reaching a boiling point. Whitmore had been suspended with pay while the investigation continued. He wasn't in a cell, not yet. His union had provided him with legal counsel, and every conversation about him now came with side glances and lowered voices. Melanie hated every second of it. She didn't want to turn on her colleague, but she couldn't ignore what Thor had uncovered. And now, it wasn't just about evidence in a locker. It was about hiding a bracelet in an unregistered evidence locker. Someone had gone to a lot of effort to bury this case, which meant that maybe Whitmore hadn't acted alone. That night, Melanie sat at home with her laptop open. She pulled up the original case file on Avery Halston, the little girl who had vanished during a family road trip in 2021. They had stopped at a rest area off Interstate 70, just across the state line. When her mother returned from the restroom, Avery was gone. The rest stop had no security cameras. One witness said they remembered seeing a police vehicle near the area, but nothing ever came of it. The report had been buried after a year of no leads. Until now. Melanie clicked through photos. Then she found something that stopped her cold. In one of the background shots taken by a gas station clerk during the initial investigation, a police cruiser could be seen in the distance. The license number wasn't fully visible, but the station number painted on the back corner. LPD 036, Lark Hill Police Department. Her hand went to her phone. Agent Temple? I think I have something you need to see. By the next morning, everything was moving twice as fast. The cruiser in the photo matched Whitmore's assigned vehicle from 2021. Maintenance logs confirmed it had been out of service for 3 days around the time of Avery's disappearance. No official explanation was logged. Temple got a warrant. They began a full forensic sweep of Whitmore's house. While FBI agents combed through boxes, drawers, and closets, Thor stayed beside Melanie in the backyard, sniffing the edges of the wooden fence. Then, without warning, he barked again. Not at the house, not at the garage, at the ground. He circled a patch of grass near an old flower bed and barked again. Temple ordered a ground scan. Within hours, they had dug up a plastic container, wrapped in a tarp. Inside were more items. A child's toy torn and faded, a journal page with crayon drawings, and at the bottom, a cell phone, water damaged but possibly recoverable. The FBI tech team worked overnight. When they powered it on, the wallpaper was a selfie. Avery, smiling. The warrant turned up other disturbing finds. A burner phone, maps, logs of patrol routes that didn't match department records. It was enough to file for an arrest. Whitmore was taken into custody just before dawn. No media, no noise, just a quiet knock on the door and a set of handcuffs. Melanie watched from across the street. Thor sat beside her in the cruiser, silent, calm. He had done his job. Again. In the following days, the case took over every conversation in town. Parents pulled their kids closer. People asked how long Whitmore had been hiding things. The trust in law enforcement had been shaken to its core. But there was also pride. Pride in Thor. In the instincts of a dog who refused to be ignored. In Officer Cross, who had trusted him even when others laughed it off. And in the FBI agents who followed. Every lead. No matter how uncomfortable, Avery's parents were brought in for questioning and identification of the items. They broke down upon seeing the bracelet and the photo, but they also expressed deep gratitude. We never gave up, her mother said. And now we know we were right to keep believing. The search for Avery's body continued. There was still hope that somehow she might be alive, but even if she wasn't, what had been hidden was now in the light. All because a dog wouldn't stop barking. One evening, a local reporter asked to speak with Melanie. You ever think about what would have happened if Thor hadn't barked? She paused for a long moment. I don't want to think about that, she said quietly. But I do think about how many other Thors are out there, trying to tell us something, and we're just not listening. The reporter nodded and turned off the camera. Later that night, Melanie brought Thor his favorite toy, a knotted rope, and sat beside him in the station's back room. "You were right," she whispered. "You were right all along." Thor rested his head on her lap, his tail thumping once on the floor, and outside, the town of Larkhill slowly started to sleep again. The silence now filled with something new. Hope. The FBI made the announcement. Just before noon, Officer Darren Whitmore had officially been charged with obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and suspected involvement in the disappearance of 6-year-old Avery Halston. The town of Larkhill froze. For days, the police station had felt like a pressure cooker. Now the pressure had been released, but the atmosphere was heavier than ever. The uniform didn't mean the same thing it used to. Trust had been cracked, and for some, it would never fully be restored. Melanie Cross sat on the back steps of the station with Thor at her side, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the concrete. She'd turned off her phone hours ago, unable to take another call from a news reporter or distant friend asking, "Did you know?" Of course she knew. She knew the Whitmore who shared coffee in the break room and who coached the department softball team. But she hadn't known this. No one had, and that was the part that kept her up at night. "People don't just wake up one morning and hide a child's bracelet in a shed," she said quietly to Thor. He blinked slowly and placed his head on her knee, as if to say, "No, they don't." Inside, Agent Temple and her team were going over something new. The burner phone found in Whitmore's garage had led them to a storage unit registered under a false name. Located 20 miles outside of town in an industrial park, the unit was filled with items that made everyone in the room go silent. Boxes of children's clothes, old VHS tapes, 2 hard drives, and a second badge, this one belonging to a police department from another state. Temple leaned over the table, pressing her knuckles into the wood. He was part of something bigger. Melanie stepped forward. "You think this goes beyond him?" Temple didn't look up. "I think Whitmore was one of several who knew how to move unseen, under the radar, with a uniform as a shield." The room fell silent. Thor paced the hallway, outside, his ears flicking at every voice, every shift in tone. Melanie finally stood up and walked to him, scratching behind his ears. "Come on, buddy," she said. "Let's get some air." They drove out past the edge of town, where the hills rolled in soft green waves and the only sound was the wind and the gravel crunching under tires. Thor leaned out the window, his nose twitching, eyes wide. This was his way of shaking it off, and honestly it helped her too. They parked near the lake where Melanie's father used to take her fishing. She unhooked the leash and Thor bounded ahead, paws kicking up sand, finally free of tension for a moment. Melanie sat down on a bench, watching him splash in the shallow water. She pulled out her phone, against her better judgment, and opened the latest case file update from the FBI database. There it was. Missing children cases with possible law enforcement links. 3 new entries added 3 children, all under 10. All vanished within the last 5 years. Each case had one detail in common. The last confirmed sighting involved a marked police vehicle. This wasn't just about Avery anymore. It wasn't even just about Larkhill. This was a pattern. And Thor had pulled the first thread. Back at the station the next morning, Thor was already on alert again. He paced near the back offices, sniffing at the door to the evidence archives. This was nothing new. The archives had been used for decades, and the smell of old cases could easily overwhelm any dog's nose. But Thor wasn't interested in any random scent. He kept circling one particular row, over and over. Melanie followed, unlocking the door and stepping into the cold, paper-scented room. It was filled with metal shelves, boxes, and forgotten files. Thor headed straight to a row labeled 1995-2005 and stopped, his nose pressed against a lower shelf. Melanie crouched and pulled out a dusty brown box with fading tape and marker writing. Case number 2398, J. McKinney. She opened the box carefully. Inside were 3 folders, a roll of film, and an envelope that hadn't been sealed properly. It looked like the contents had been handled multiple times. Inside the envelope were photos, grainy, old, but one of them made her heart stop. It was a little girl with a purple ribbon. Not Avery, but the same ribbon, same style, same look of fear in her eyes. Melanie flipped through the file. The girl's name was Jenna McKinney, age 7, disappeared in 2001 during a school trip. The case had gone cold after 6 months with no leads, but what made Melanie's stomach twist was the name listed as one of the responding officers, D. Whitmore, volunteer. Observer training program, he had been there too. As a trainee, Melanie called Temple immediately. Later that afternoon, Agent Temple and her team sat around the table reviewing the new evidence. What this tells us, Temple said, pointing at the folder, is that Whitmore didn't start this in Larkhill. He's been on this path for years, possibly decades. And he wasn't even a full officer yet, Melanie added. He found a way to involve himself even before he had a badge. Temple nodded. But now we might be able to trace his network. If he kept these photos, there's a chance someone else helped him get them. We dig into the training program records, pull every name, cross-reference them with missing persons. Melanie swallowed hard. And the kids? Temple's expression tightened. We search every property, every vehicle, every storage unit, every log. We owe it to them. By evening, Melanie drove home exhausted. But Thor wasn't done. He kept pacing near the front door. Then he whined, something he rarely did. You smell something? She asked, crouching beside him. He barked once and headed toward the back room, the one where she kept her old files, gear, and K9 manuals. Thor scratched at one of the boxes near the corner. Melanie opened it, expecting to find old uniforms or gear. But beneath the fabric was something she had almost forgotten about, an old flash drive. One she had been given years ago by a retired officer who once said, "There's stuff they didn't want me to file officially." She had never looked at it. She plugged it in. The folder opened with dozens of files labeled by initials and dates. Each contained audio logs, notes, photos. Some matched locations Whitmore had worked. Some matched victims now being re-examined. Her hands trembled. Thor sat beside her, eyes steady, ears perked. You knew, she whispered. And now, so did she. The next morning, Melanie walked into the station with the flash drive in hand. Temple was already at her desk. I think you're going to want to hear this, Melanie said, placing the drive down. Temple took it, slid it into her laptop, and within seconds, her expression changed. This is evidence. A lot of it. And it's admissible. Then let's use it. Temple looked up at her. You ready to go deeper into this? Melanie looked down at Thor, who stood tall beside her, tail low, body calm. Yeah, she said. We are, because Thor hadn't just sniffed out a locker. He had opened a door to a truth no one wanted to believe. But the truth was out now, and it wasn't going back in the box. Agent Nora Temple sat at the head of the conference table inside the Larkhill Police Department. The walls around her were plastered with photographs, maps, names, timelines, a full-blown investigative web that had started with one German shepherd's bark and had now grown to span 2 decades and at least 5 jurisdictions. She leaned forward, eyes narrowed at a photo of Darren Whitmore taken during his academy years. He was smiling, confident, like he had the world in his hands. What no one knew then was that this man, this officer, had been collecting secrets since the start, and burying them so deep even trained agents hadn't seen the signs. Until Thor did. Let's go over the timeline again, Temple said, tapping her pen against the table. Melanie Cross, seated to her left with Thor at her feet, was already a step ahead. Jenna McKinney, 2001, training program in Springfield. Whitmore was a volunteer, no direct connection but present at the scene. Temple nodded. Then Avery Halston, 2021. His vehicle was spotted near the rest area. The girl vanished within minutes. And now the flash drive, Melanie added. The one we recovered from my house? It ties Whitmore to multiple missing children's cases over the last 20 years, and most of those kids were last seen near law enforcement. A grim silence hung in the room. Thor shifted beneath the table, then let out a low huff. He was tired. They all were. But they couldn't afford to stop. Not now. By the end of the week, a task force was officially established. The case had moved far beyond Larkhill. The FBI partnered with state police departments across Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania. Each one began digging through their own cold case files, looking for patterns, missing reports, or anything that hinted at buried truths. Melanie found herself assigned to the cross-agency communication team. Her role was simple: coordinate, track, and filter new findings. But she didn't stay at the desk long, because Thor had become something else. He was no longer just a K-9 unit. He was an asset, a living, breathing compass that kept pointing to what others overlooked. On Thursday morning, they were called out to an old cabin site 30 miles outside of Larkhill. A retired officer had owned the property. He'd passed away a few years back, but his name had come up in connection with Whitmore's early assignments. Melanie stepped out of the truck with Thor and let him sniff the perimeter. It took him less than a minute to start barking. Behind the cabin, beneath a moss-covered stone slab, the FBI team discovered a sealed container. Inside were dozens of old cassettes and photos. Children, most unidentified. One, however, matched a face they now knew all too well: Avery Halston. Temple's team moved fast, scanning the area, collecting evidence. Melanie stood nearby with Thor, her hand on his back. "You just keep finding them," she whispered. "You keep finding the truth." Thor didn't wag his tail. He didn't bark. He just stared into the woods beyond the cabin, as if searching for more. The deeper they dug, the more disturbing the picture became. This wasn't about a lone predator. Whitmore had been part of something wider, something hidden. A group of men, some retired, some still in uniform, who used the system to shield their actions, and no one had noticed. Or maybe, as Temple later said, they had noticed and looked away. Melanie couldn't sleep. Her thoughts raced every time she closed her eyes. She kept seeing those faces on the board, the missing kids, the evidence boxes now piled in the makeshift FBI command center. Each one was a story never finished. One night she woke up to Thor whining near the door. She got up, opened it, and followed him into the living room. He stood by the couch and looked toward her laptop. Melanie blinked, confused. Then it hit her. She had left an open file on the screen, one of the original traffic stop records from Whitmore's early years. The document showed a routine stop on a back road near a state park. But what caught her eye now was the timestamp. 3:17 a.m. What officer performs a routine stop at 3:17 a.m. in an area with no traffic? She opened the dashcam footage. Archived but still functional. There was no stop, no car pulled over, just Whitmore's cruiser idling on the side of the road for 23 minutes, lights off, and something else. At the 20-minute mark, the camera picked up a figure in the distance, small, moving slowly toward the woods. Melanie froze the frame. A child. The next morning, Temple called an emergency meeting. More evidence had been recovered from the cabin site, including a notebook that detailed drop points and storage zones. They were vague, written in code, but someone had already begun the process of matching GPS data with Whitmore's patrol history. One entry stood out: Drop 7, Ash Fork Trailhead. Green tag, that location was in a state forest Melanie knew well. It had never been part of any official patrol route. By noon, a team was en route. Thor rode in the back of the SUV, calm but alert, his ears perked. Melanie drove. When they arrived at the trailhead, everything looked normal. Empty parking lot. Birds chirping. A signboard with trail maps. But Thor jumped out the moment the door opened and pulled hard toward the woods. Melanie followed with 2 agents behind her. They hiked for nearly a mile before Thor stopped. He barked twice, then sat down. At first they saw nothing. Then one of the agents brushed away a pile of leaves near a fallen log, a buried crate. Inside was a collection of small items: a pair of light-up shoes, a plastic tiara, a necklace with the name Katie on it. The FBI matched the necklace to a child who had gone missing from a campground in Kentucky 2 years earlier. Her case had gone cold after only 6 weeks. Until now. Melanie turned to Temple, who had arrived shortly after the crate was uncovered. This wasn't a drop. It was a trophy spot. Temple nodded, the fury in her eyes barely contained. We keep going. We find everyone. Back at the station, the board grew larger. More names, more faces, more evidence that the system had failed, but that it could still fight back. And through it all, Thor remained at the center. He slept beneath the whiteboard, beside the files, never straying far from the scent of the truth. One of the agents from Pennsylvania, a gruff older man named Wilkes, watched Thor one day and shook his head. "That dog," he said. "He doesn't just track people. He tracks guilt." Melanie smiled faintly. "You'd be amazed what he's capable of." They weren't done, not even close. There were more cabins, more sites, more names whispered in the pages of forgotten reports. But they had a lead dog now, and Thor never lost the trail. The days were starting to blend into each other. Melanie Cross hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night in over a week. The map, inside the FBI's command trailer, had grown into a maze of pins, lines, photos, and evidence markers. What began with a bark at one locker had unraveled into a sprawling investigation spanning years and multiple states. But today felt different. Thor had been unusually still all morning. No pacing, no barking, just sitting quietly beside Melanie's desk, eyes locked on her every movement. "You okay, buddy?" she asked, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. He didn't react the way he usually did. No tail wag, no soft nudge against her hand. He just kept watching her. Then he stood up and walked toward the hallway. Melanie followed. The hallway led past the evidence room, past the interview suites, and into an area of the station that had been used for storage since the renovations 3 years ago. Most officers didn't even go down there anymore. Thor moved with purpose. He stopped in front of an old maintenance closet. It hadn't been touched in months. He sat down and let out a low, sharp bark. Melanie stared at the door, heart thumping. She reached for her radio. "This is Officer Cross. I need access to the back hallway maintenance closet. Bring gloves, flashlight, and a fresh evidence kit." 10 minutes later, Agent Temple arrived with 2 forensic specialists. Melanie opened the door. It looked like nothing at first. Just a dusty mop, some paint cans, and a cracked fire extinguisher bracket. But then Thor walked inside and began sniffing near the baseboards. He growled. Temple crouched, brushing away a corner of the laminate flooring. Underneath it was a small, cutout in the subfloor, a hidden space roughly the size of a shoebox. Inside was an envelope, and inside that envelope was a photo. It showed 2 girls. One was Avery Halston. The other, unidentified, but she couldn't have been older than 8. On the back of the photo was a name, C. Denton, and below it a message handwritten in small, tight script. "You were supposed to keep quiet." The room went still. Temple stood up, holding the photo, gently. "We need to find out who this girl is." Melanie's voice cracked slightly. "You think this was a warning?" "I think it was a reminder," Temple said, "and we need to know who it was for." She turned to one of the tech agents. "Start running the name, C. Denton. Go as far back as you need. School records, hospital visits, child services. I don't care how long it takes." Then she turned to Melanie. "And keep Thor close. He just found something no one was ever supposed to find." By late afternoon, a name finally popped up in the database. Cecily Denton. She had been in foster care in southern Ohio from age 5 to 8, placed in 3 homes before she vanished in 2006. Officially, the case had been closed, marked as a runaway. But the last home she had been placed in? It belonged to a man named Greg Talbot, retired sheriff's deputy, and Whitmore's first field training officer. Temple stared at the screen for a long time. "Get me everything on Talbot. Where he lived, where he worked, and where he is now." The next morning, the team headed out toward a wooded area outside Athens, Ohio. Talbot had owned a large property there, a hunting cabin, a workshop, and 4 acres of woods. No one had lived there in years. Melanie, Temple, and Thor arrived first, followed by a forensic crew and a ground radar team. The property was quiet, covered in fallen leaves and long-forgotten memories. Thor moved slowly, his nose scanning the air. Then he stopped near the back of the cabin, sat down, and looked directly at a tree stump near the edge of the clearing. Melanie walked up beside him. Something about the stump looked off. She reached out and knocked on it. Hollow Temple gave the order. They cut it open carefully. Inside was a sealed tin box, old, rusted shut. When the lid finally gave way, it revealed a set of photographs, aged and curled. One of them showed Cecily Denton, the same girl from the photo found in the closet. The other photos were harder to process. They were of other children, some identified, some still unknown, but all connected now by a growing thread that started with Whitmore and seemed to run through Talbot and several others. Melanie looked at Temple. This was a network. Temple's voice was steady. It was a system, and it used uniforms to stay invisible. The next few days were a blur. The tin box photos matched victims from 3 separate states. Temple was now coordinating with federal prosecutors, marshals, and multiple AG offices to issue subpoenas, reopen closed files, and identify every child in the images. But something was gnawing at Melanie. Why hide one photo inside the station? Why, now? And who was supposed to see it? She started combing through internal records. Who had been near that hallway in the last 3 months? Who had keys to that closet? Most of the names were familiar, except one. Officer David Muncie, new transfer, recently assigned from a nearby county. Quiet, no complaints. Clean record, too clean. Melanie looked up his transfer paperwork. It had been approved by Whitmore. 2 months before Whitmore was suspended. Her blood ran cold. She pulled up surveillance footage from the hallway 2 weeks ago. There he was. Muncie, walking down the hallway, carrying something under his arm. Entering the closet, 6 minutes later he left, empty-handed, and now there was a photo inside. Temple moved fast. Muncie was brought in for questioning the next morning. He denied everything, said he was just dropping off a box of broken tools, but Thor? Thor sat in the corner of the room during the interrogation, silent, staring. Then, when Muncie shifted in his chair, Thor stood, growled, low and dangerous. Temple leaned forward. "You know what that dog just told me?" she said calmly. "That you're lying, and I trust him more than I'll ever trust you." Muncie broke. Not fully, but enough. He admitted Whitmore had reached out to him months before the arrest. That he'd been told to keep something safe. A package with photos, names, and a warning. Muncie had panicked after the FBI moved in. He didn't want to be caught with it, so he stashed it where he thought no one would ever look. But Thor did. Of course Thor did. Later that night, Melanie sat on the back steps of the station again, Thor by her side just like always. "You keep doing this," she whispered. "You keep telling the truth when no one else can." Thor looked up at her. His eyes were tired but steady. "I don't know where this ends," she said softly, "but I'm not walking away." She leaned into him, forehead resting against his. "You and me. We finish this." And somewhere in the stillness under a dark Ohio sky, Melanie knew that one bark had turned into something much bigger than anyone expected. It had become a reckoning, and it wasn't over yet. The first snowfall came early that year. Light flakes drifted across the sky above Larkhill, blanketing the ground in a soft silence that felt almost sacred. The air was cold but calm, and for the first time in months, the police station no longer buzzed with panic. There was still work to do, files to close, children still unaccounted for. But something had shifted. The truth had broken through, and it started with a bark. Inside the federal courthouse in Columbus, the trial of Darren Whitmore was reaching its final days. What had begun as a local internal review had become a national case. Headlines ran across every major news outlet. K9 dog uncovers hidden evidence, exposes officer in missing children network. The evidence was overwhelming. The photographs, the journal entries, the surveillance footage, the flash drive. But most damning of all had been the testimonies. Foster children, now adults, who finally found the strength to speak. Former officers who had been afraid to come forward. And one, a woman named Sandra Keene, who had once worked as a dispatcher in the county where Whitmore trained. She told the jury about strange calls, orders to delete logs, and threats if she asked too many questions. He wore the badge like a mask, she said, her voice trembling. But that dog saw right through it. Thor didn't take the witness stand, of course, but his presence was known. Photos of him at the locker, at the cabin, by the gravesite. And to everyone who followed the trial, Thor had become something more than a working dog. He was a symbol. Melanie Cross sat outside the courtroom with Thor beside her, rubbing his chest as they waited for the verdict. The FBI agents had been kind, always making sure Thor had a space to rest and a quiet corner to recover after long days. But Melanie could see it. He was tired. He had given everything. Temple stepped out of the hallway, her expression unreadable. "They're ready." Melanie took a deep breath. Together they walked in. The courtroom was full. Reporters, victims' families, police officers from across the country, and when the foreman read the verdict, guilty on all counts, the silence cracked open into quiet sobs, gasps, and finally applause. Whitmore didn't move, didn't flinch, just stared ahead, as if the walls were caving in and he had finally run out of places to hide. After the trial, Melanie and Thor returned home. No press. No fanfare. Just her modest house on the edge of town, the porch light flickering like always. It was the first time she'd stood still in months. She took Thor off his leash, opened the door, and let him inside. He walked slowly now. Not limping, not in pain, just older. She filled his bowl, poured herself a cup of coffee, and sat beside him on the floor. "You did it," she whispered. "You really did it." Thor leaned against her, his breathing steady, his body warm. For a long time, neither of them moved. A week later, Melanie received a call. The Department of Justice had formally acknowledged Thor's contribution to the investigation. They wanted to honor him at a ceremony in Washington. Temple was already making arrangements. But Melanie hesitated. Thor had never worked for the applause. He didn't know about medals or speeches. He just knew right from wrong. Still, she agreed. They drove out together, passing through towns that looked just like Larkhill. Places where secrets had been kept for too long. Places where maybe, just maybe, another dog like Thor could help shine a light. The ceremony was simple. A plaque, a medal, and a standing ovation as Melanie led Thor to the podium. She said only one sentence. "This dog taught me to listen, not with my ears, but with my heart." The room erupted, and for the first time in his life, Thor barked at the sound of clapping. The following spring, Melanie made a decision. Thor would retire. Not because he couldn't work anymore, but because he had earned something very few ever did: peace. He spent his days in the backyard, chasing butterflies, watching birds, and napping in sunlit patches of grass. Melanie planted a garden nearby, filling it with marigolds, sage, and tulips. She called it the Garden of Second Chances. Children from nearby schools began writing letters. Some drew Thor's face in crayon. Others wrote things like, "Thank you for saving kids like me." One letter had a single sentence in shaky handwriting. "You're the only reason I believe in good people again." Melanie kept that one above the fireplace. On a quiet Saturday morning, Temple came to visit. They sat on the porch with mugs of tea. Thor stretched out between them, snoring softly. "How many others have we found?" Melanie asked. 8 more, Temple replied. "So far, and we're working through a list of 16 open cases that match the same pattern." Melanie exhaled. "And the network?" Temple nodded. "We've made 5 arrests, 2 others fled the country. But we've frozen their accounts and issued international warrants. No one's getting away, not this time. Melanie looked at Thor. You think he knows? I think he always knew, Temple said, smiling gently. We just didn't know how to listen. They sat in silence for a while, and then Melanie said something she hadn't voiced in months. I think I'd like to write about him. Not just the cases. Him. What it means when someone, even a dog, sees what others refuse to see. Temple nodded. I think a lot of people need to hear that. That night, Melanie opened her laptop and began typing. She didn't start with a date, or a case number, or a courtroom. She started with a dog who barked when no one else did, who saw what others ignored, who kept walking toward the truth no matter how painful it was. She wrote about courage, about silence, about secrets and justice. She wrote about the people who tried to hide the truth, and the others who helped pull it into the light. And she wrote about how justice doesn't always arrive in sirens or suits. Sometimes, it comes on 4 paws with eyes full of fire and a heart that never gives up. As she finished the last sentence, she looked at Thor, now curled up beside the fireplace. Thank you, she whispered. His tail wagged in his sleep. And somewhere, far from the cities and the noise, in a small town that would never forget, a woman and her dog fell asleep knowing they had changed the world. One bark at a time. Life lesson and final reflection. Justice doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wears fur. And sometimes the smallest voice, the bark, the cry, the whisper, is the one that ends up saving lives. The question is, if a dog could see the truth and risk everything to reveal it, would you have the courage to do the same?